So we all know D.I.C.E. They're renowned for pushing out some very graphically impressive titles, but did you know that one of their earlier ones was a bit more unique? This right here is a disc, and you can see that, but what's on the disc is what matters. This is a copy of the hit's 1997 game Volvo S40 Racing, and well, we're going to be seeing exactly what it is and what is going on, so why don't we talk a little bit more about the history of it. The year is 1992, and Digital Illusions was founded in Sweden, a small group of 4 friends and a few members from The Silence, a demo group who developed for the Amiga. It was from here they released their first titles, Pinball Dreams and Pinball Fantasies, which flung them into commercial success. It's from here the releases slowed down, with 2 Amiga releases, the first namely Amiganoid in 1993 and Benefactor in 1994. The following year, of course, they targeted the PC market yet again with another pinball game, this time Pinball Illusions, receiving either glowing praise or really mediocre acceptance from some reviewers at what was once again another pinball title. It may have been because of this that 1996 saw no releases whatsoever, but as you may have remembered from the start of this video, not too long from here brings us the year of Volvo S40 Racing. The turn of 1997 brought 2 titles from D.I.C.E. True Pinball in early March, which was once again, in true D.I.C.E. fashion at this point, another pinball title. This time released just for the PlayStation and Sega Saturn to capture the console market, but they had another couple of projects in their hands. 2 titles, a similar concept, but the main thing that separated them was, well, Volvos, and a year between release dates. So let's rewind back to March, and True Pinball had just been released by D.I.C.E. In the following 45 days, though, they would go on to create the groundwork for these 2 projects, with that groundwork being released as Volvo S40 Racing, and the more polished title going on to what would become the decently received racer, Motorhead. So Volvo S40 Racing, from what it seems, is a very bare-bones racing sim, commissioned by the Swedish motor company in the late 90s, with sales figures allegedly totaling near 16,000 copies of the game shifting from the shelves, which is not exactly a spectacular amount. But still, for a company that was pretty much renowned for a lot of pinball games and a few Amiga titles, it actually turned out to be something relatively impressive. Running natively on Windows 95, it is what many believe to be D.I.C.E.'s first showing into the world of decently impressive 3D graphics, and for a 1997 based title, I'd be inclined to agree, considering this is only 45 days worth of work. But is it actually any fun? I mean, what's the game actually like? We're going to be running the game on Windows XP, as the system requirements like to recommend a 90MHz Intel Pentium processor, 16MB of RAM, Windows 95, a Super VGA graphics card able to show high colour, and 20MB of disk space. And finally a keyboard. They're quite adamant you have a keyboard. There are of course the recommended requirements, but these basically serve to suggest that you have twice as much of everything. Still, from what we can see here, the game has 2 courses, namely Knowlby Hills, a longer track which features more winding roads, as well as a section that makes it slightly easier to spin out of. It also has a secondary track included which goes by the name of Ocon Speedway, which appears slightly more basic with a simpler, shorter design, with notable points being a varied elevation in certain places, and a tunnel which looks pretty. Other than that, you've got transmission selection, which includes automatic and of course manual, both of which are viable options in the game, but menus are well and good, but what you actually came here to see was the game. And here it is, Volvo S40 Racing, in which every car is in fact a Volvo S40 Mark I, and 7 of your opponents you will face here will be Volvo S40 Mark Is. And well, that's about all there is to it when it comes to vehicle selection. You're free to start the game, and what type of features does the game behold for you? Well, not actually all too much actually. I'm not going to pretend it's a bad game, because it really isn't. But you know when a game lacks polish in certain areas, even for its age, well, that's one thing that certainly speaks out a lot here, but we'll touch on some of those things in a bit. What's the actual racing like? I mean, that's the name of the game. Well, rather unremarkably, you know that high-octane feel that completely trumped any form of realism in early racing titles? That's honestly what they've gone for here. The controls with a keyboard admittedly are rough at best, and attempting to take corners at speed will result in you spinning out and drifting, something that you might be able to do better if you had a wheel for your computer, but you need an older one as modern ones don't seem to work very well here. I doubt modern S40s have actually done any type of drifting, even the ones in the 90s wouldn't have been able to do this, but still, it's interesting to see in this game. The speed is measured in kilometers per hour, something that makes perfect sense given the game's Swedish origins, and now I can't say I have much experience with the Volvo S40 in real life, other than having moved one a couple of meters forward and then a couple of meters backwards again at one point. Anywho, at least in this title they appear to be quite a nippy little beast. I will give them some credit here, you can definitely have your fair share of high-octane racing around these two circuits. And there are some redeeming qualities to the game. I mean, during times like this, it's important to remember that this was a glorified tech demo made in 45 days, and it plays like one, but it's still fun, which is what matters for a game. But still, where does this all fall down? Collisions are hit or miss really, with it being relatively too common to have someone clip into the back of you with no impact whatsoever, which doesn't really bother me too much as it's a late 90s racing title. But the issue comes from the rest of the collision mechanics. If you touch another car, or another car touches another car, in fact just if anything collides and actually registers, it all leads to a chaotic mess of cars flying all over the place, bouncing off each other like they're made of rubber. Now I know Volvo are pioneers of safety, but I'm highly doubting they can bounce off each other 100 miles an hour. Then again, they continue on their merry way until it happens again. See, this wouldn't be too bad and can make for some rather comical moments, but the issue is that with the intensity that the AI seems to like crashing into one another, you'll be hard-pressed to find a single race with a consistent race leader, because chances are they'll eventually cock it up and end up crashing into something else, and then into their competition, leading to a massive pile-up near the finish line. Honestly, the AI is impressive that it manages to keep going forward, but that's about its only redeeming factor. Other than that, you have the controls, which are your standard 90s affair and don't warrant much explanation. In fact, you have to find them in a TXT file to even know what's going on, which can be a bit confusing for new players. And by new players, I mean those that weren't around during the 90s, before WASD became the norm of controls. Other areas include little nods to other Volvo products that remind you this is a glorified advertisement made to market Volvos to you, reminding us that not even a Volvo can protect us from jealousy. Although I will say nowadays, with the price those things are selling for, they might actually be onto something, and they are probably better at racing than what we're using right now. Then you've got the usual adverts bragging about turning circles on buses, very exciting stuff, and then to top it all off, we now know that if our neighbour buys a 4x4 we should buy a dump truck, so thank you very much Volvo S40 for this hit racing advice. The game does offer a time trial mode, which is a standard of the genre, and honestly, when left with the mediocre controls and no comical opponents, it's definitely the weaker of the two modes, and only really worth investigating if you like chasing high scores. Other than that, you can check the records and top times, and of course see the credits, which shows the names of the developers. Other than that though, the only other area to touch on is that this is actually a surprisingly impressive showing, at least for a 1997 title made in a month and a half. They actually pulled off something quite cool and very playable. The best way to describe the game's aesthetic is that it looks like an upscaled PS1 title, which seems quite fitting that the groundwork would actually go on to become a PS1 title. The models are actually relatively highly detailed considering the era, and the game supports some very high resolutions, and I had no issues running the game in 1280x1024 at well more than a few hundred FPS most of the time. So suffice to say that DICE knew how to optimize a title even back in the day. The game wasn't actually too hard to break though, which is where the game can lose some of its charm and its impressive aspects. See, other than the AI getting stuck in signposts from time to time if they crash into them, this can happen to you as well. There's also some minor clipping of textures that remains no matter what type of system you used or operating system you decide to choose. However, given the tiny development period, I'd say it's actually a very competent racer, and I was very impressed what they've managed to pull off, even if there are some cracks in what is otherwise a decently fun advert. But a fun racer either way. So why does any of this actually matter? Well, it doesn't. It was just something I wanted to touch on, as not many people have actually covered this. That, and this would lead them to the actual commercial success of the game that I mentioned earlier, Motorhead, which used a lot of assets and essentially was just an expanded and polished version of Volvo S40 Racing released on the PC and PlayStation. Really, there wouldn't be too much to say about it, so I'm not going to do a full video on it, I'm just going to touch on it real quick here, but it's fast, it's refined, and would go on to become D.I.C.E's first title to shift over 1 million copies. So it's fair enough to say that it's the start of something big over at D.I.C.E. From here, well, you know the story. D.I.C.E would go on to work in-house for EA, churn out some decently enjoyable titles that trump the tech found in Volvo S40 Racing, but for the start of their 3D era, I think it's actually quite impressive. Although there are hints to something greater that seem to exist if we delve deeper into this strange era. But we're not touching on that, so good night. So, definitely a different video this time round. I hope people found it interesting. There's some more PC-based content on the way next week, or sooner actually. It's going to be an interesting one involving an old PC. So I'll catch you in that one, and you can always like and subscribe for more like this.